Welcome to this vodcast. We're going to do a couple of vodcasts on hypothesis writing because it's a fairly important topic. The first part of our vodcast is going to be looking at what exactly a hypothesis is, because it's very hard to write a hypothesis if you're not sure what it is. There's a very famous writer called Stephen Covey who talks about being successful, you need to begin with the end in mind. So let's do that now. Let's figure out what the end product of a hypothesis actually is, because that's going to help you write a hypothesis later on. Firstly, let's define our terms. Sometimes a hypothesis is actually called a thesis statement. Now, if you're wanting to do any online research into hypothesis writing, searching for a thesis statement is a very helpful way to go when you're looking at a hypothesis for history. Often the word hypothesis is used in science, and that's a different type of hypothesis to what we're talking about in history. In history, it's called a hypothesis or a thesis statement. Now, we can define it in many ways. For our purposes, you need to consider a hypothesis or a thesis statement to be, firstly, a statement, a sentence. Secondly, it's one that articulates your response to a particular historical problem. Often we've set in an assessment item for you. Lastly, this statement is based upon your research and the evidence you've found. So it's a statement that articulates your response to a historical problem, and it's based upon the research, the evidence that you have come up with. It's your idea, your answer, your statement in response to a historical problem. I quite like this statement. It says that the thesis statement, the hypothesis, is the controlling idea around which you construct the entire paper you have. In a history paper, the thesis statement, the hypothesis, generally explains why or how something happened. Every word of your paper, your essay, your assignment, your oral, should support your thesis. Now, the source of this quote is really interesting. It comes from a university in the United States called Bowdoin. And Bowdoin is so renowned for its history writing that Harvard University uses this advice created for Bowdoin for its own students. So let's move on to what a strong hypothesis will actually look like. It's going to be succinct, short, to the point, precise. It's not wordy, it's not too long. The words that are chosen are very, very carefully selected. We need to be very careful about exactly the terms, exactly the ideas that come through in this succinct statement. A hypothesis is a way of limiting the scope, the extent of your response. It ties your essay to a certain time and a certain place in history. It limits the breadth of coverage of your assignment. It reflects the task you're responding to. Often a strong hypothesis uses words that are found in the task. If you're trying to write a good hypothesis, therefore, look into the task you're given to see what the keywords are. A strong hypothesis, in essence, is a summary of your response to the set task. It's your answer. It's the central idea on which the whole paper hangs, and that central idea should be your answer to the question set. A strong hypothesis ends up being placed within the context of a wider paragraph, often called your introduction. It's revisited throughout the whole paper, and it returns again embedded in a conclusion. But this is important for you to know, because some people try to cram far too much information into their hypothesis statement, as if there is no other information around the statement when it's finally put together. So you need to think, I'm going to be succinct. I'm going to word my ideas carefully. I'm going to make sure I tie this statement to a particular time and place. I'm going to make sure I reflect the task I've been asked to examine. And I'm going to really use this statement I've written as an answer to the question without having too much extra information in there. Have a look at again what Bowdoin College says. The thesis statement, the hypothesis, should be contained in a single sentence that's concise and grammatically correct. Now, it's possible to have longer hypothesis statements than one sentence, but the better you get, the more succinct they become. And one sentence is a very short, sharp, succinct hypothesis statement. Aim for one sentence. Let's think about what a hypothesis isn't. Firstly, a hypothesis isn't a fact. It has to be open to some argument. You're on a journey to uncover facts when you're writing a hypothesis. You're trying to expand our understanding on a topic. You're opening up a point to further argument, further conversation amongst other historians. So a hypothesis isn't a fact. One thing that we need to remember is that hypotheses often aren't as hard to write as many people think they are. A thesis statement can actually be a fairly easy statement, certainly at its initial stages, in its drafting stages. It might be hard to get exactly the right words you're after, but generally speaking, a hypothesis isn't a scary, frightening, difficult task. A hypothesis can't be done at the last minute as I don't have a hypothesis moment. It can't be an afterthought. It's a central part to your planning of your entire paper. It is one of the first important jobs you do after beginning your research. A hypothesis isn't an optional extra. It is something that must be in your history paper. There's no room for doubt. It has to be in there. Let's think a little bit about the core elements of a strong hypothesis. A hypothesis will often carefully limit, focus a time frame. It'll carefully limit a place. It'll draw upon keywords, concepts of the set task. It may often contain what is called a concessional phrase, and we're going to look at some of these elements in part 2 of hypothesis writing. Now, it might have other elements, but you need to think about these and really use, I guess, a bit of common sense as you try to draft a hypothesis in relation to a question you're asked. It's often said that a hypothesis contains a reason. Such and such happened because of these factors. This occurred because of this. This occurred for this reason. But this depends on the task that you're set. You don't always have to have a reason. A reason is sometimes referred to as a because clause within a hypothesis. You might not even use the word because in this because clause, but it's possible that your hypothesis will include because, a reason. It doesn't have to. There is an element of choice and common sense involved here. It depends very much on your task. It's probably good now to have a look at a few hypotheses that have been written by, I guess, students around the world who are quite expert. And many of these examples have been adapted, again, from Bowdoin. So let's look at our first one. US government officials allowed discrimination against Japanese Americans between 1942 and 1945, not because it was in the nation's interest, but to provide a concrete enemy for people to focus on. First thing I'd like you to think about there is that it's open to argument. There's an argument about whether or not discriminations against Japanese Americans actually existed. It's open to argument that that discrimination wasn't in the national interest. And there's an argument and opinion there that is about this whole issue of providing a concrete enemy for people to fight on. So it's not a fact. It limits a time and place. This task is very much about what happened in the United States. The hypothesis limits a time frame to 1942 to 1945. Now, it's interesting to note that this hypothesis doesn't have a because clause. It doesn't contain a reason. It doesn't say why US government officials allowed discrimination. To some extent it does, but it doesn't have the word because. Let's have a look at this second hypothesis. Although the Scopes trial, 1925, was a legal farce, it reflected deep ambivalence in American thinking because so many conflicting attitudes met headlong in Dayton, Tennessee. So we have firstly a clear place. I better say it right, a clear time being defined. It has a clear place, Dayton, Tennessee. This one has a concessional clause. It uses although to start off, weighing up one side against another. Although it was a legal farce, it reflected something else. The underlined part is our because clause. It offers a reason. Let's look at one final example. It's a little different. Starts with a concession, although. Although freedom made life generally better for African American women after 1865, freed women lost some of the power they held in the family under slavery. So let's think about how it communicates place. It speaks about African American women. So we've identified from that use of words a place, America, the United States. It identifies also a time, 1865. It clearly, like the other two, has an element of opinion in it. It's not a fact. All of them have carefully selected and chosen words. They use some terminology. They probably use words of tasks that are set for those universities. But now let's think about this last one in terms of, does it have a reason? Essentially, the point here that the author is going to ask is a sense of contrast. It doesn't say why women lost power, okay? It doesn't really talk about how life was generally better. It doesn't therefore have a statement of reason, a because clause, but it's still a very strong hypothesis. All three are different. All three are hypotheses. All three would be appropriate for you to use as models. I thought I might just finish now with a link for you to a guide to writing thesis statements put out by Bowdoin College. I know the hyperlink is unable to be clicked on here because it's embedded in a video, but it does allow you a source to go to read further on hypothesis writing. The image at the bottom of the screen here is Bowdoin College in Maine in the United States. Thank you for watching this video. Well, in part 2, we'll talk about how you might actually construct a hypothesis.